Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. I would like to extend a very pleased welcome to all of our community members, our parents who've taken the time to come in this evening, our friends from various businesses and organizations. It's truly inspiring to see people come out on a Tuesday evening, and this is a very proud moment for Dwight. It's also a story I'd like to share that started about 2 months ago. Our chancellor in New York City, Mr. Stephen Spahn, chancellor of the Dwight schools, gave me a call and said, "Gavin, this guy, you gotta meet him." And sure enough, the last 2 months have been very rewarding for me as a professional head of school. I love knowledge, and I love inspiring knowledge. I love giving that out to the audience in terms of our school, our students, and you are very special because tonight marks a very important day in the life of Dwight School Seoul. Dwight Presents is the first lecture series in a series that will be monthly coming forward for our community members to engage with audience keynote figures on stage here at Dwight School Seoul. And I'm very pleased to say that the person I was introduced to is not the person speaking, but Mr. Wan from the Lindenbaum Pre-College School. He's an accomplished violinist, attended Juilliard amongst many distinguished universities in the United States, and is a maverick in his own right. I've heard him play, and I'm very pleased to say that, please put your hands together, rather, for introducing and welcoming Mr. Wan. Mr. Wan.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm very honored to be here, and thank you for Dwight School people for preparing this wonderful event. I know it was such a short period of time to prepare, but this is really great. The reason we have chosen this place, it's because it is a school, and there are students, especially young. Because when I was in your age, I had a hero. So when I grow up, I want to be like him. Tod Machover, he's a professor at MIT Media Lab. Not only he's a professor, but also he's my hero. What he's doing is, with music, he's composing. And he's trying to solve the problems for the society and for the world. That is really, really great things in the world, especially musicians like me. Although I'm a violinist, can you imagine music can save the world? It was a very coincidence that I met him in the film festival in 2017, where I saw his documentary film called Symphony. So it is about his passion that he's trying to solve the city problems in Detroit with using his music. So during the documentary film, he is meeting with a lot of people in Detroit and try to get their different voices in his music. So at the finale, when Detroit Symphony plays his music, oh my God. So I contacted him, and I met him at the MIT Media Lab, and it took about a year that finally he's in Seoul now at Dwight School, Seoul. And also, we, Lindenbaum Festival Orchestra, last year, during summer, we played his piece called Fence Dance. But it was with the young people, young students from all over the world. They're not professionals, but we had one mission. It doesn't matter whether it's young or professionals or old or young. The mission tells us that through music we can save the world. And in the Korean Peninsula, what we have problem is divisions, lack of communications. But through music, we were able to speak throughout the nations, even throughout in the orchestra. That's the message, the power of music. So now I really, I'm so honored to be Todd Micawber. So hope we can listen to his lecture.
Okay, so on behalf of Dwight School Seoul, we're honored to welcome Professor Tod Machover, called America's most wired composer by the Los Angeles Times. Micawber is widely recognized for his most significant and innovative composing of his generation, and is also celebrated for inventing new technologies for music, including hyper instruments, which he launched at the MIT Media Lab in 1988. Whether it is creating genre-breaking compositions for the concert hall, robotic operas for worldwide stages, software that allows anyone to compose original music, or musical activities that can diagnose illnesses and restore health, Tod Machover's unique vision is shaping the future of music, while producing work that will touch the hearts and minds of audiences all over the world. Tonight, the coordinated efforts of Dwight New York, Dwight Seoul, and the Lindenbaum Pre-College program unite under one umbrella to deliver an important message that will hopefully have an impact on a future Symphony of the Koreas. Please welcome Mr. Professor Tod Machover.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for that most generous introduction. I'm really honored to be here tonight. I've traveled quite a bit around the world, but today is my second day ever in Korea. It's the first time I've been here. So I've been spending 2 days learning as much as I can about the country, and I just love it here, so it will not be my last time. I have one more day, so this is a 3-day trip back and forth from Boston. But I'm so glad that one of my main stops is here tonight, so I can tell you a little bit about some of my ideas and what we plan to do here in Korea. So we are, in fact, starting a project to make a very special piece for the Koreas, and I'll end up by telling you about that. But I thought I'd tell you a little bit about my journey first and some of the things I've done along the way. So I grew up in New York, and I don't know if you can tell which of these people is me, but that's me in the middle. And a lot of what I do actually is influenced by my parents. So my mom is a concert pianist. She went to Juilliard, and still a fantastic music teacher. I was the oldest of 3 children, so she tested her music teaching skills on me when I was very, very little. And she was special because she taught piano, but she also taught us how to compose music from the very, very beginning. She always thought that making your own music was just as important as learning to play other people's music. And my father grew up in the middle of the United States in Iowa, and he was an engineer. He was one of the first people in the field of computer graphics, one of the first people to figure out how to put pictures on a screen well before Windows or the Macintosh. And he really believed that if computers could be used naturally by people, they would have incredible power. And so I grew up with a technology father and a music humanist mother, and I think I was really obsessed with it. They liked each other a lot, so I was obsessed with why 2 people so different could get along so well. And so I've spent a lot of my career putting technology and music together. My instrument is cello. Actually, I started as a pianist when I was 3 or 4 with my mother, and I love my mother dearly, but it's really great to study a music instrument not with your parents, so I changed to cello when I was pretty little. And I played kind of normal cello, classical music until I was a teenager. And then I figured out, I started playing rock music, I wired my cello, started making the cello do lots of things it wasn't really supposed to do. I experimented with it, which I still do. And these days, when I play the cello, it looks kind of like this. We make special instruments, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a moment. I went to Juilliard and a lot of different places. I lived in Europe, but the last while, I've done a lot of my work at MIT, and you might have heard of the Media Lab. It's a special part of MIT. It's kind of the coolest part of MIT. It's a laboratory which is designed to do anything we can to make people's lives better. In fact, to make the world better, but specifically to make individual lives and lives in society better. And that could be through music and through the arts, but it also could be through education or medicine or really anything that we think can make a difference. So it's a collection of people who are very, very different in their backgrounds, all working together. When they invited me to come to the Media Lab, they said that this place is the most interdisciplinary community you can imagine. Now we say that it's anti-disciplinary because we actually think that the most interesting things going on in the world these days are things that are in between the traditional disciplines. They may be music, but they also involve technology. They may involve neuroscience. They may involve design. They're not easy to describe. And just like I'm sure many of you students here, a lot of the students who come to work with us at MIT, at the Media Lab in particular, are good at 3 or 4 or 5 things, and it's very hard to say that person's a musician or a mathematician or a programmer or a hardware designer. There's some kind of hybrid, and I think the world is moving to people whose skills are quite hybrid. So, for instance, just to give you an example, these are 3 of my colleagues, 3 professors who I work with very closely. The person on the left is named Neri Oxman. She first studied medicine, actually, and decided after going all the way through medical school that she didn't really want to be a doctor. What she really wanted to do was be an architect. So she got a PhD in architecture, and then she decided to combine the two. So she actually designs buildings that are based on biology and based on nature rather than based on building techniques. So she might design a new structural element which actually is based on a human bone rather than on concrete or steel. Or, for instance, she taught silkworms how to spin in particular patterns. She has a very famous project called the Silk Pavilion, which is a large dome that was actually spun by silkworms who were taught to spin in exactly the pattern that they calculated on the computer. It's the most incredible thing, and it's been exhibited around the world. You can look it up. The person in the middle is named Hugh Herr. He's in his early 40s now. When Hugh was a teenager, I think 17, he told me he was a terrible student, and really all he liked to do was climb mountains. And so he was, I think, the highest ranked teenage mountain climber in the United States, but he had an accident and he lost both his legs. And so at the age of 17, he got fit with artificial legs, and he thought the artificial legs were so primitive, so bad, that he decided to do whatever he had to do to make artificial limbs that were better than natural ones. And so he's probably the most well-known intelligent prosthetic designer in the world. He has the laboratory right next to mine. And so these days, Hugh he climbs mountains again, but when he climbs with a golf bag that's fit with 10 pairs of legs. So he goes up with a pair of legs special for ice, special for extensions, special for crevices, and he says to me, "Todd, you can't do that," which is true. An amazing guy. And Danielle Wood on the right is one of our newest professors, and she did all of her degrees, bachelor's, master's, and PhD at MIT in space science. She's an expert in satellite technology, and she worked for a couple of years at NASA before we hired her. So she does design space technology, but her big interest is using space technology back on Earth, especially to help communities in developing countries have advanced communications technologies, infrastructure improvement technologies, so that people can improve their communities with the most advanced technology in the world. So it's combining space and inner cities all around the world. So these kind of hybrids are remarkable to have all in one place. It's a wonderful, wonderful community. I invite you all to come and visit us when you're in Boston. And what it's allowed me to do, Mr. Wan Hyungjun correctly said that I think, again, because of my parents, I really, from the very earliest time of my life, I always loved music, but I always thought of music as something that wasn't just pretty and beautiful and nice to spend time with. I thought of it as something that really can change people's lives. It changes lives because it touches us so deeply, because it's something that we do together. It's something that can shake us up and make us think differently, and it's something that can go beyond many human differences to allow us to see each other as common human beings. And so at the Media Lab, I've been able to do more different kinds of projects in music, to think about the future of instruments, the future of how music sounds, the future of what an opera might be, the future of how people who are not trained musicians might be able to make music, and even how we can shape our health through music in a way that I probably wouldn't have been able to do if I'd been just at a music school or just as a traditional musician. So I'll tell you about some of these things. I started out building instruments. I love playing the cello. I wanted my cello to be able to change into a flute or a voice or a full orchestra just by the way I played. So I collaborated with Yo-Yo Ma, that's Yo-Yo when he was a little younger, but we built a special cello for him called a hypercello, where the cello understands the way Yo-Yo plays. It understands if he plays more gently or more aggressively, or if in a phrase, la 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 la, he emphasizes that note, or he doesn't. And depending on his interpretation, the cello does indeed change while he's playing. It feels like an extension of his body. It doesn't feel like the normal, I'm playing an instrument and I've got some technology on the other side. It's incredibly natural. So maybe I'll just show you a little quick bit of video of the very first performance Yo-Yo Ma gave with this hypercello. This is at the Tanglewood Festival with the Boston Symphony. It's funny because Yo-Yo plays this cello in those days. It's about, 17, 18 years ago. You'll see that there were about 15 computers on stage. About 4 or 5 graduate students from MIT were needed to run all this equipment. These days, you can, the instruments that we build like that, I can usually run on my smartphone and use an instrument that already exists. But this was the beginning of this field. So here's Yo-Yo playing the hypercello at Tanglewood.
Last month, they premiered their piece, Begin Again, Again, at Tanglewood.
Maybe I'll stop Yo-Yo there. So that's all done live. All the extra layers, all the extra cello is all done. It all comes from what he's playing. It's layered, modified, changed by the way he's playing. So the cello itself becomes a whole orchestra. We build these instruments for rock musicians, orchestras, all kinds. And we also make very large shows. So my group at the Media Lab is called Opera of the Future. I love writing opera, but some of the most unusual operas you'll ever hear. Opera is really a form where you can take all the different artistic forms, all the different senses, and combine them with music at the core. That's why we call them operas. This is one of the more recent ones called Death and the Powers. And it's about a man named Simon Powers who wants to live forever. And actually, he's kind of tired of the world. He's rich, successful, powerful, a little crazy. We think of him kind of like a combination of Walt Disney and Steve Jobs, somebody like that. And he wants to leave the world, but he wants everything about himself, his ideas, his memories, his ability to communicate with his family and his business associates. He wants those to stay. So he invents something called the system, where he can disappear and he can download everything about himself into his environment. So at the beginning of the show, he says to everybody, I'm going to turn this system on, see you later, I'll still communicate with you, but physically I'm going to be gone. And in fact, the singer in the show disappears. He actually, we have an orchestra pit. He goes down with the orchestra into a little booth. You don't see the singer again until the end of the show, but during the show, we measure everything about him, just like with Yo-Yo Ma, except here we measure his singing, We have a video camera on him that measures his body movements and his facial gestures. We measure his muscle tension and his breathing. All this information, some of it is controllable, some of it is subconscious, that gives you a sense of what he's feeling during the show. And in fact, we have a whole bunch of computers which measure the emotional change of this character during the show, and all of that information is sent back to the stage so that, just like he says, you don't see him, but you see a stage with giant walls and with props, like there's a big chandelier, which is actually a big robotic music instrument. All the lighting, the sound, everything is a reflection of how he's feeling when he sings. So you do feel like he's on stage even though he's not there physically. And the whole show is really about whether his wife and his daughter and the people he works with really think that this is him, or whether they think something's missing, whether you can, in fact, recreate a human being via technology. He also has he has kind of pets, which are these robots that he makes. So there's a whole chorus of robots which also translate his ideas on stage, and they react to the audience, they sing, they move around the stage. And again, everybody has to decide if this is part of this human being. I'll give you a hint. Everybody in the show, except for his daughter, actually think that this new existence he has, where physically he's never going to die, physically he's not there, but he's become alive in another form. Everybody else thinks that's a pretty good idea, and they all join him in the system. But his daughter, no matter how much she loves him, feels like there's something missing, and that you can't really be a human being without all the negative sides of being a human being, and you can't reproduce somebody just in technology. So here's a little bit from the opera, just about a minute, to give you a feeling of what that is. And you'll see at the end, she decides not to go with him into the system. That's how the opera ends. So a little bit of Death and the Powers.
I can still sign tracks.
There you go, the whole opera in 1 minute. Now you don't have to go see it when it comes to your local. The robots have the last word. They actually have the first word, and at the end they come back. They've watched this whole show, and because it's about a human being and mortality, the robots come back at the end and go, "That's the whole show? I didn't understand it. What's death? I don't get it." So anyway, technology is not likely to take over from us completely anytime soon. I can reassure you. We build these gigantic shows, we make instruments for Yo-Yo Ma, but I'm equally interested in using technology to make music accessible to everybody. So we make a lot of instruments for young people. This is what we call a rhythm tree. These are individual rhythm pads made out of polyurethane rubber. It's very firm but also delicate. So we put little fibers, little wires inside that vibrate, and depending on the direction and amount they vibrate, you can tell how the pad has been hit. So each one of these pads, you can touch very lightly or you can hit quite hard, you can kick it. We fill up rooms with hundreds of these pads that are all networked, so it measures whether one person is playing or many people are playing, and it can measure the collective rhythm. So if the rhythm starts to be synchronized, it can add to that and make a room full of really wild synchronized music. But if people are playing things that are quite different, then it can add to the chaos and make something which is quite complex. So it reflects the behavior of a whole group of people rather than just one. We make all these kind of instruments. I always do these projects because there's an artistic reason, a human reason that I make them. But it's amazing how often the projects end up somewhere that I didn't expect, and often end up in commercial things that do rather well. So some of you may have played Guitar Hero and Rock Band. Both of those games came out of my lab, and they came directly from the technology and the hardware and the software that we developed for Yo-Yo Ma, and they turned into making games to shape music, and they turned into a company to make those games. And all of the technologies behind Spotify also actually came out of trying to measure a violin live and to monitor that, the generation after Yo-Yo Ma, and that turned into how one piece of music is like another, and how we can match music. And so these projects, I encourage all of you to go into really unusual music and technology projects, because they always pose very interesting human problems, either measuring human gesture and emotion, or taking in information and deciding what has to happen with that as a result, that usually an engineer would not normally ask. So they end up discovering things that you wouldn't discover any other way. It's a great field to be in. Before I talk about our symphonies, one last thing that I wanted to mention of the many things we do is that I really, really do believe that music touches us very deeply, so deeply that it can affect and shape our health. There's research going on in more and more universities and even hospitals around the world where people are trying to discover what are the principles that make music, why does music make us feel the way it does, can it change the way we think, and every week these days we're learning more evidence that they're very solid scientific principles that we can build on. One thing that we've tried to do is to use the same idea behind a Yo-Yo Ma hypercello to allow people who can't communicate any other way to communicate through music. So this is someone named Dan Elsey, who was born with cerebral palsy. He has spent his whole life in a hospital near Boston. And we did a workshop at his hospital. The Massachusetts state government asked me if I wanted to try to do some work with health. We spoke to a room this size filled with patients. I talked about some of our work, and I said, who would like to do some workshop with our technology? And different people said yes, and Dan, who couldn't raise his hand, indicated that he was interested. So when he started working with us, we learned very quickly that he loved music. He was quite talented. Nobody had ever asked him if he liked music. He can't talk, so he has different ways of indicating words. So we said, why don't we build you an interface with your head, actually. We built a head tracker with infrared so he could move his head to indicate what he wanted to choose. And I'm going to show you some software in a few minutes that we let him use, and software that allows you to compose original music just by using lines and color. And he got very good at that just by using his head movements. So good that people started to notice, and a lot of you have probably seen TED Talks. So I'd given a couple of TED Talks, but the TED people said, wow, this work you're doing with Dan is fantastic. Why don't you come out to California and the two of you can present a talk? So we brought Dan out to California. He'd never been more than about 2 miles from the hospital in Boston. And we made a second instrument for him, an even better head tracker that allowed him not only to compose his music, but to perform it on stage. So we gave this presentation at TED, and it's quite fantastic. You can look it up online, so I won't show it to you now. But it proves that when Dan is performing his own piece using technology that can measure his movements, that can rehearse with him to know what he wants to express through the music, When somebody sees him on stage, they don't see somebody with cerebral palsy. They see Dan Elsey. They can see what he's like, what he wants to share with you, and there's an absolute direct communication that wouldn't happen any other way. So we do a lot of this kind of work. There's some brand new evidence that I wanted to show you also with music and health. If you take one thing away from tonight, I think this is actually the coolest. This was in the New York Times just a few days ago. A couple of my colleagues at MIT, one at the Media Lab, one in the Neuroscience Department, discovered about a year and a half ago, they were playing with mice, and they found that if they flashed lights at a certain frequency, actually literally at about 40 hertz, so pretty fast, they noticed that normal mice seemed to like that. It was like, wow, that's a pretty good movie. So you get 50 mice, and they'd all stare at these lights flashing. They're, well, that's interesting. So then they tried the same thing with older mice who were, kind of a little sleepy. And the older mice with these same lights, after about an hour, they really liked this too. So they said, well, what if we take mice that have Alzheimer's disease? Because they were doing experiments with Alzheimer's mice. Could that have an effect? So sure enough, after 2 days of exposure to the lights, the Alzheimer's mice who couldn't find their way from one end of the cage to another, they could hardly stand up. The Alzheimer's mice were also alert. They could find their way through the maze. This was crazy. Nobody knew why. So they did research, they did fMRIs, they even did surgery on the mice. And they found out that these frequencies dilated, they enlarged the arteries in the brain where plaque builds up when you have Alzheimer's. So, that wasn't the right button. 1 second. I think I need these lights. Let's see. There you go. So that's a picture of a mouse brain with pretty advanced Alzheimer's. All those white dots are plaque in the brain that stops signals from going from one part of the brain to the other. Did you just make the light on stage brighter? Thank you. After 2 days of exposure to these lights, that's what the mouse brain looked like. So over half of the plaque has disappeared, and with more exposure, a huge amount of the plaque disappeared. So they found that these lights did amazing things to the brain, and then we keep finding out more things. The next thing we found out is that sound at 40 hertz does equally well as the lights do. This works in humans and not just in mice. And the paper, the reason this ended up in the New York Times last week is it turns out that if you have frequencies and light at around 40 hertz, the combination is much huger than anybody expected. So it seems to make all kinds of connections in the brain that wouldn't be made otherwise. It seems to improve intelligence and clarity of thought. So everybody's talking about this, and we're working with this group to figure out how this works with humans. Can we make music with these frequencies embedded in them? I'm writing a piece right now. I should be back in Boston writing this piece. I'm kind of late with this piece of music, but it's the first piece of music that is a real piece of music that has these gamma signals embedded in them. And I think this is really important because it shows that it's quite possible that without medication and without surgery, just with sensory input from music and from visuals, we might really be able to improve people's health and cure or treat Alzheimer's and many other mental illnesses. And if I were 15 years old, again, I would say go into the field of music and health because it's going to be huge. We're working on it, but the younger generation, you could make a huge difference in this area. And we're also this is an instrument that one of my PhD students made. It's a gamma instrument, which allows, it's designed for anybody to play, but especially for people with Alzheimer's, to make music just by rubbing your fingers. These are little metal surfaces that generate music just by touching them. And there's always a low gamma frequency, but you can add all kinds of beautiful music on top of it just by moving your hand on this surface. And the whole surface pulsates with gamma light depending on how you move your hand. So again, this is an attempt to have people be surrounded in a gamma environment in a way that's pleasing and interesting and will hopefully allow somebody to stay long enough with this experience to make a difference. So the last thing I want to tell you about is the project that leads to our experiment here in the Koreas. As I said at the beginning, what interests me most about music is its ability not just to change people's lives, but to bring people together. We love to listen to music that we care about together. We love to share music that we care about. We love to play music together. There's a bond even between listening to music and playing music, and we can push this really far. What I'm really interested in is collaboration, rather than separating people by who's an expert musician and who's a student and who's listening and who's playing. I really like to set up situations where everybody can make music together. So for the last 5 years, we've been working on a big project called City Symphonies. They started in Toronto when the Toronto Symphony Orchestra asked me to write a symphony. And I said, of course, I'd love to write a piece for you, but since you're the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, I'd like to make a musical portrait of the city of Toronto. And I want to use the orchestra and use regular music. But I'd also like to listen to the city, to the cars and the waterfront and people in cafes, to see what it is about this city that's special, that conveys something about itself just through its sound. And I also want to ask everybody in the city of Toronto, anybody who wants to work with me and my team at MIT to create this piece together. So, of course, it would be partly my piece, but I want it to be also anybody's piece who wants to contribute. And unfortunately, the Toronto Symphony said yes, because I had no idea how to do this with 4 million people in Toronto. But they're a great organization. We worked for a year to develop this project, and it worked out really, really well, and now has become kind of popular. So we did one in Toronto, we did one in Edinburgh, Scotland after that, then in Perth, Australia, Lucerne, Switzerland, Detroit, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute, Miami, Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, we actually made the front page of the New York Times because they loved this idea of, I don't know, anybody here been to Philadelphia? I bet none of you have been to Philadelphia. Ha. Interesting. It's a great place, actually. I'm going this weekend. But Philadelphia has this tradition of cheesesteaks where it's kind of a very working class city in a lot of ways. And they have these big grills where they make steak and mix onions and cheese with it. So I went to all the cheesesteak places in Philadelphia and recorded them all. And then I made a solo section in the symphony of the sound of these cheesesteaks with the orchestra playing along with the cheesesteaks. And the New York Times got really interested in that and followed me around. And so these symphonies have attracted a lot of attention. We get everybody involved. We make apps on smartphones so that it's really easy for anybody to go out, record sounds in the city, also to record video. Everything that gets recorded gets geotagged, so as more and more material, video and sound comes in, it becomes placed on a map of that city. Anybody can go and listen to it. You can also take anybody's sound as part of the project and morph it, combine it with your sound. So you can listen, but you can also combine anybody's sounds with your own sounds. We get all kinds of sounds. If we can have audio for that, those are the quietest cows I've ever heard. These are actually cows from Lucerne who are really musical, you'll see. Audio for the video? Try one more time. Oh, should be the same as the other audio we had. She's making a sign at me. One more time?
Nope. No audio.
No audio?
No audio.
Well, nothing changed. So, yeah. I think it's up there because I didn't change anything. Anyway, those are quiet cows. There's a quiet machine. This is actually Henry Ford's very first engine, which I used as a solo instrument in the Detroit piece. This is a silent street musician in Detroit. So anyway, we get all kinds of sounds. We make lots of software that allow people to play with those sounds and to manipulate them and to personalize them. So for instance, we can take thousands of sounds, put them into a blender. Each sound gets analyzed by many different features, like is it loud, is it soft, is it a nature sound, is it a musical sound, does it start boom like that, does it start very slowly? And it gives each sound a color according to its characteristics, and then it makes a kind of star map out of these sounds. And if it's a tablet with your finger or on a computer with your mouse, you can just move over the sounds, hear them, and then blend them all into your own mix of the audio from that city. We make software, for instance, where I can write a few measures from, this is actually a little bit of the finale for the last movement from the Symphony in Toronto, and before the piece was ready, I put out a little bit. It went something like bum 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 ba bum 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 ba 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 bum, like that. And you could use a virtual spray can and change the texture and color of that melody. And when you did that, it turned the melody into a full orchestra piece exactly the way you wanted. So you could make it very detailed and make your own version of that melody. You could extend it also into a whole movement. This would be really great if we could hear it. Did you find something up there? What are you pointing at? You're pointing at a person. Somebody's coming down. Yeah, I'd love you to hear this next one if I could. Let's just take 1 second. What do you want to do?
Preference.
Yeah. This is intermission. What are you looking at?
Preference.
I can't understand.
Preferences.
Preferences. You want sound?
Yes, sound.
HTML. I mean, nothing changed here.
Right.
Okay. Oh, now this is going to go away. Now they're going to see my email. Let's see. Okay, so that's coming back. We'll bring this. We'll go back to the presentation. All right, cross your fingers, everybody. Oh, cross your fingers. Let me just see if there's actually sound. Yay. Thank you, team. Thank you, tech team. Awesome. Okay, so this is software that we wrote called Hyperscore. This is the software that Dan Elsey used for his music. And I wanted to have software that anybody could use to write their own original music. I originally designed it for pretty young kids, like age 5 to 8, 5 to 9. So people could write music that could be played by some of the world's great symphony orchestras. And now it's used by people of all ages in a lot of different places. The basic idea is that the little boxes we call motives, and the little dots you see in there are really notes, but you don't have to think about traditional notation. You can drag them higher or lower to make higher or lower notes, and you can make them larger or smaller to change how long they are. And you can do the same thing with rhythms, and you can do the same thing with chords. So basically you start out by making a bunch of little elements, melodies, phrases, whatever you want to call them that you like. You give each one a color, and then you draw with the color on that screen. And depending on the shape that you draw with, it modifies in a pretty sophisticated way whatever your original element was. And if you want to, you can just put directly on the screen whatever you like, and if you want to do something really crazy, like a piece that goes, la, I can do that. But I can also use all the rules of music, like harmony and synchrony and counterpoint, by calling up parts of the program that will adjust the music so it actually can play any chord you want to, and by manipulating the middle line, the blue line, that's like all that you study in harmony, I can do just by changing the shape of that line. So it's quite a powerful program. I do my piece on the computer, but then I push a button and it writes out the piece for notes so musicians can read it, so an orchestra can play it or a rock band or whatever. So I'll play you just a little example of this is a little fragment from the Symphony in Toronto. We had kids from throughout the city write pieces about something about Toronto that meant something to them, put it into music. I collected really thousands of these pieces, listened to the ones that I thought were most interesting, took little bits of them, turned it into kind of a tapestry, and this is just a little example of how these fit together and what young people can do with a tool like this. So pretty incredible for 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th. So all around the world, we have young people producing music like this that become part of these symphonies. All of this information comes to me. The media lab where I work is like a 21st century amazing modern building, but I have an 18th century farm about 20 minutes from MIT where I do all my composing work. So I get all of this music there. I put some of it together with pencil and paper, some of it on computer, some of it on my keyboard, and turn it into a symphony that gets played by huge orchestra, sometimes with singers, sometimes with extra players, with lots of electronics. And thought I'd give you just 2 examples. This is a little trailer for what we did in Detroit, and then I'll play you just a minute of what the piece in Detroit sounded like.
Tod Machover, and I'm a composer and an inventor. For a long time, I've tried to use technology to bring music closer to people and also to make music itself grow. So when we started talking with Detroit, the idea we came up with was, let's make a portrait of Detroit. Let's convey to really the people around the world what the city feels like, what's important about it, what people care about through sound. Let's do it through music. Let's do it with an orchestra, so all the beautiful sounds that instruments can make. But let's also think of what story is told actually through the sounds the city makes, whether it's traffic, or people talking, or people making music in that city.
I think what Todd's doing with this program, the sounds that we're going to gather and the voices that we're going to hear are new, they're fresh, they're vibrant, and they're full of hope and optimism, which is something that you don't normally see when you talk about Detroit.
I love how he's incorporating like all the sounds of the city, and he's giving people who've lived in Detroit and know the city the best the opportunity to share with the rest of the world what they love about the city themselves.
Detroit is full of people who know how to go out there and get things done, who know how to make a way out of no way.
We're going to make a big piece of music for the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. We're going to show the world what Detroit sounds like. And so here's just a minute or so from the final Symphony in D with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, and you'll see a bunch of people from Detroit who I invited to be part of the piece. You can make it a little louder.
If you can't see, we are not done yet. If you don't recognize the genius in refusing to be generic, If you still can't tell the difference between the boom and the bass, you've never been to Detroit. But don't worry, we'll still be here when you decide to learn.
So in Detroit, it was an incredibly important project because, as you know, the city kind of collapsed and fell apart. It's in the process of being rebuilt. And this project actually served to bring people together from all over the city, from all kinds of different backgrounds, to listen to music together, to listen simply to each other, and really built up a whole level of community that wasn't there before. So I still go to Detroit. I'm actually going there in a week to work on a whole series of big projects, infrastructure projects in the city. So the next project we're doing is here. The idea is to make a symphony about the entire peninsula, and to make something that will show people living in Korea what Korea is like now, what it sounds like, and hopefully to show people around the world maybe a vision of what peace could be like in this part of the world where it's maybe more difficult than many places. I'll be working on it with the Lindenbaum Orchestra and Organization and the MIT Media Lab. I was just, actually I think I have a picture. We visited the demilitarized zone, one of the most dramatic places in the world. I'm doing this because Mr. Hyung-Jun Won came to me about a year ago and said that our vision about using music to transform the world, and especially to bring the idea of communication, understanding, and peace to people through music, that it was very similar what we were thinking about. He told me about the Lindenbaum Music Festival. We realized that we had a vision very much in common. We did a first project together this last summer at the Lindenbaum Music Festival, where the idea was to do a kind of test piece, something which wasn't a full symphony, but something where we could try getting a group of especially young musicians together to listen to each other and to do something collaborative and unusual. It turned out at the last minute I wasn't able to come to Lindenbaum this last summer myself, so I sent two of my students, that's David and Hain from the MIT Media Lab, and Toshi Shimada on the right is the conductor of the Yale University Symphony Orchestra, who also conducts the Lindenbaum Festival Orchestra. My student Hain, when she was here, gave a series of lectures to young musicians about music and technology, about the idea of collaborative music making, and about our particular piece. The rehearsals and the performance took place at Camp Greaves in the demilitarized zone. How many of you have been to Camp Greaves? Probably most people. Oh my God, the same number who've been to Philadelphia. That's incredible. That tells you something. It's also a place that's really worth it. Incredible place to go to. This was the, I guess, original bowling alley for military personnel stationed, I guess, right after the Korean War at Camp Greaves. And a lot of the facility is exactly the way it was back in the 50s or 60s. It's mostly abandoned. There are other military forces there now, but they use more modern headquarters. So it's a kind of a time capsule. But they've changed the bowling alley into a place where you can do lectures and performances. So it was a great place to do this concert. I did make a special piece. We didn't do any recording of natural sounds. There wasn't time to do that. So there were no electronics in the piece. But what I did is I wrote 3 different kinds of music. Some of the music was very precisely notated, so and actually pretty hard to play. So bum 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 bum, and everybody playing the same thing together, which is quite hard. There were other sections. I don't know if you can quite see, but the rhythms are very precise. but instead of notes, they're X's. And that means that you have to play the rhythm that I wrote, but you can play any note you want to. So the rhythm might be bum 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 bum, but you can play bum 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 or boom. So people are free to improvise around a structure. So the orchestra all of a sudden goes from being everybody together to being it sounds pretty crazy. And then I wrote a third kind of section where I give people license to be even more crazy. It might be, if you want to stand up and play something that you made up, stand up anytime you want to and play it. If somebody else is playing something and you want to comment on what they're doing, you can stand up then. Do that for a certain amount of time, and then hear if there's a single note that everybody's playing and everybody converge on that. So those were kind of free rules for people to listen to each other. And it was amazing. I was back in Boston at my house, and they did a rehearsal, and they said, could we Skype with you so I could hear the rehearsal? And I was pretty nervous because I knew the piece was hard, young musicians, I wasn't there to explain it. And we had the Skype session, and I was so moved and impressed by how well these kids were, and you know, I guess the oldest kids were probably early college, but they were middle school through high school kids, playing fantastically well, not only with spirit, but with incredible precision and with musicality and creativity. So and by the time they gave the performance, which was broadcast on TV here in Korea, it was fabulous. So that convinced me that this exercise of working with younger musicians with the Lindenbaum Orchestra is going to lead somewhere fantastic. This is what it looked like with the orchestra at Camp Greaves. And so this is my exploration. This is yesterday. So I got here yesterday. I'm trying to learn as much about it. I mean, I've had Korean friends since I was a kid. I know a lot about Korea. I read a lot of books, but there's nothing like coming to a place. So for instance, I came here and got greeted by that robot at baggage claim. Definitely wasn't, we don't have that in Boston or anywhere in the US as far as I know. Had a great bulgogi and Pyongyang noodles yesterday. I'm very impressed in this city with the combination of kind of pattern and regularity, and really, it's a very complex place. As you probably have noticed, Seoul is organized in I can't figure it out. It doesn't have a grid plan. It's a very organic, really interesting city. And at the same time, there are very clear rules. We were in the Hanok village today, and there's signs everywhere, as you probably know, saying, please whisper or don't talk loudly, which I've never seen anywhere in the world. I find it's a very quiet city for a major city until you go inside, when at restaurants or at clubs it's wild. So there are incredible contrasts here, which I think are really interesting. This was yesterday. So most of you haven't been up to the DMZ? You have? Yeah, okay. So you probably know those two people. Maybe they're your friends. And just amazing to, as you all know, to see this incredible nature and complex situation. The geography is very strange because since the Han River curves, you're never quite sure if you're looking north or south or which country is which I think is all part of the complexity of this division. Was at the National Museum of Korea yesterday, which besides being a great museum has, some of the most beautiful objects of contemplation and meditation. You might very well have seen this Bodhisattva from the 7th century, which is kind of a combination of very fine detail in the way the fingers and hands and face is depicted, but then an extremely abstract and elongated, gentle depiction of the body. So again, there's this kind of contrast between precision and looseness, which I don't think I've seen anywhere else. This is one of the most beautiful Buddha statues I've seen in the whole world. And then, of course, you walk outside the museum and it's complete chaos with little alleys, and you get lost and so much going on at once. It's one of the most interesting places in the world, and so I want to discover this and be able to share this complexity. And we want to find a way that we're not quite sure how yet, but that we can make musical communication between people in the South and people in the North. And we're quite resourceful, both the Lindenbaum organization and ours. We will find a way. We've got some ideas, but that's part of the project. So the real Symphony for the Koreas project actually starts right now with this visit. And we can only make this project with people helping us, because it's not just my project, it's not just Lindenbaum project, it's a project for anybody who wants to help think of what the musical story is that can represent Korea now and can contribute to it. So there are all kinds of things that we need to do. We need to collect sounds, we need to discover music and musicians. This could be traditional music. I've been listening to a lot of traditional Korean folk music. There's great classical music. There's plenty of K-pop. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting music that's worth listening to and deciding whether we want to use it. There's original music that people around Korea are going to make for this project. So we're going to be creating a lot of original music, either with hyperscore, sometimes in jams and in workshops. We're going to be listening to all of these sounds, and as I said before, the most important thing about this project is to set up a context where we can listen to each other's music, but just listen to each other's voices, which is such a hard thing to do in today's complex world. And we can add spice. It's going to be a music piece, but we might decide that it'll have video or images, or we're going to meet with Hyundai tomorrow. They're a sponsor of the work that we do at the MIT Media Lab. And when I talked to one of their representatives a week ago, he said, wow, we're really interested in this project. Do you think you could somehow use cars in your symphony? And I said, I bet we could. So we'll see what's in there. And maybe the idea is to make a kind of musical bibimbap. Bibimbap, as you know, is a combination of ingredients. It's again, quite unique in the world. It's a bunch of fantastic ingredients that come to you without being mixed, and you can put hot rice on them if you want to, you can put broth on it if you want to, you can put sauce on it if you want to, but it's customized by each particular person. It's mixed in a different way by each particular person, and so maybe that's what the texture of this composition will be. And the real idea is, through this composition, to show the world what peace sounds like, what peace feels like, and to show the world that peace simply is possible. Thanks very much.
Let's give Todd one more round of applause. Thank you so much. 10 minutes of practice. Amazing. Well, Professor Machover has been kind enough to sit down with us and allow us to ask him questions and just engage in a little bit of dialogue. First of all, I just want to say you blew my mind again and again and again. Your presentation was incredible, and it's great for us to be able to follow up and kind of go a little deeper on a few things. So I get the first question that I would like to ask the new technologies surrounding Alzheimer's are incredible that you touched on. And I'm just curious if you might talk about...
If they're going to be ready for us when we need it, that's what you want to know.
Where do you see what products do you see coming out of that? Or what treatments do you see coming out of that? Where does that technology go? Is that a channel on Spotify that we'll be able to turn on one day soon and just listen to through our headphones? Or where do you see that going?
Right, so the next thing to figure out, which we're trying to figure out now, is for humans, what kind of treatment works. So, is it like a 5-minute blast of gamma frequencies once a day? Is it, it looks like it's probably an hour-long session, maybe once a day or maybe once a day for a week and then stop. But we don't know that yet. So I think that'll determine how you want the treatment. There's no question that having an app with this would make a lot of sense. You do need pretty low frequency, and most headphones are, I guess you could use Beats or, but most headphones aren't that great for low frequencies. So I don't know how many of you know what subwoofers are, but subwoofers are the boxes that make a room shake when you play music. Most of this gamma, especially in audio, the gamma treatment works incredibly well with powerful subwoofers. So we're actually making special rooms at the Media Lab that are kind of gamma rooms where you just feel this experience. My colleagues, there's actually at MIT in the neuroscience department something called the Aging Brain Initiative, which is looking at both research and treatment for all kinds of just what happens with our brains when we get older. And they're extremely optimistic about what could happen with this gamma frequencies. They're actually kind of using a term which is gamma society, which might mean that you walk around outside and we hear traffic noise and construction noise, and they're saying it's conceivable that having gamma frequencies in the environment kind of all the time would be extremely beneficial whether you're doing a treatment with it or not. So it's a wide open field, and stay tuned.
And you mentioned subwoofers. Is there any chance that the Miami hip-hop low bass that we've listened to already
is good for us?
Yes.
Well, it looks like, I guess this, not surprisingly, our reaction to frequencies is quite sensitive. So 40 hertz is the frequency that seems like the sweet spot for gamma, but it varies a little bit depending on the person. If you have a really strong subwoofer and you're close to it, like you're standing right on it or sitting on it, and you start going lower than 40 hertz, I don't know if you've ever done this, it's really weird. You can actually feel different parts of your body, different organs start like feeling really weird depending on what the frequency is. So I bet that that hip-hop stuff in Miami is doing you no good. Vibrating the wrong organs is my guess. I don't know. I was just down there and I came back.
not cured. Okay. Yeah. And just to switch a little bit, this is your second day in Seoul. And I was just curious, like what sights, sounds, has anything jumped out at you that might find its way into a Seoul city symphony eventually?
Right. So usually this trip, we're packing so much in. My hosts who are from the Lindenbaum organization are the kindest people. We've sort of talked about many places to go and see, and we've also had a lot of meetings with possible collaborators, either schools or organizations, as well as funders. And I haven't done what I usually when I go to a new city. This is what I'm going to do next time. Is I usually get lost for 2 days and just wander around the city on my own without any plan, just following what seems interesting and listening. And then I can let my ears and my eyes and, you're kind of like eavesdropping on a city. So I haven't done quite enough of that yet, but I have noticed a lot of things. As I said before, I think there's something about the combination of order and complexity in this city, which is quite unusual. I mean, there are many things which are very ordered, like the traffic and stores, everything's set up very well. But I asked today, honestly, at one of our meetings, whether there was actually any central planning bureau in Seoul, and I bet if there is, it doesn't have any power, because I think the city has grown up incredibly organically, and probably somebody says, I want to put this building complex here or that, and so it's kind of like the mountains. The mountains are irregular and all around the city, and I think the whole city's grown like that. So there's something quite complex that I want to unravel. I think the fact that the nature is right in the middle of the city is very unusual, and which also leads me, for a city this size, 10 million people or so, you might disagree, but I think it's one of the quietest large metropolitan cities I've ever seen, and I think it's partly because traffic is so slow that cars don't move very fast. But you don't hear. I don't think I heard a single horn honk today. If you'd had that kind of traffic in New York or L.A., and it's a little cold outside, but it's not that cold. I didn't really hear any conversation on the street, except in kind of inner markets. But you go inside a building, inside a cafe. I had an interview today with one of the newspapers in a really beautiful cafe. It actually had cubicles, like conference rooms that anybody could use. And that place was so loud that we had a hard time hearing each other over a table. Just everybody was talking really loud. So I think there's some contrast between inside and outside and privacy and something like that, which is really intriguing to me. And I think there's a tension between individualism and kind of being a homogeneous society that you see kind of everywhere, and people wearing the same things, and then all of a sudden something crazy happens. And so these are the kind of things that I look for and that you can represent in sound. I haven't heard like the iconic sound of Seoul yet for me. So actually, I'd love to have suggestions about what to go to listen for.
Well, I have a jar of something that I was going to have you smell and see if that creates the sound, like in your imagination, the sound of a bassoon, or what instrument that draws up for you. So
I will smell that, but before I do, I'll say there's a huge amount of work. There's a huge amount of work right now on. So we know that music. One of the reasons that music is so powerful with Alzheimer's disease and memory loss is that music has a very special relationship to our memory. You might have heard this, and you may have experienced this with loved ones, but music is almost always the last thing that people retain when they've lost almost all of the rest of their memory. You can find somebody who can't recognize their family, maybe can't even recognize themselves in a mirror, and if you find a song that they relate to, and actually my mom has pretty bad memory now, and when I go to visit her, it doesn't even have to be music that she really knows, music from a certain period, or for her, any music. That person will sing along with the music. They'll often know all the words, and while the music is going, they're themselves again. It's amazing. But we think it might even be more powerful with smell. Smell is very understudied, and you might, smell is one of the things that'll bring back very, very clearly a sense of someplace you've been, perhaps, or something that happened in your life. Maybe, I don't personally know whether we have as broad a sense memory as we have for music, but it's really powerful. So some of my students are doing experiments combining smell and music right now. Doing experiments like, if you have a certain scent and listen to the same piece of music and then change the scent, does the music feel different to you? Is there some way that you can express that? So, all right, what are you going to make me smell?
Kimchi.
Kimchi.
Maybe all of you will be able to smell it as soon as I open the lid. Okay.
I should also say that I have really good eyes and ears. My sense of smell is like the worst sense I have. So
I guarantee you will smell this.
I smell this. I didn't have dinner. Can I eat this?
Yeah. No fork.
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah, amazing. So I know kimchi well. I actually went to Juilliard, and one of my closest friends there was a pianist from Korea. And she made her own kimchi, and she would invite me over often to try different kinds of kimchi. So I'm a real fan of kimchi. So I think, what does it mean to translate one scent into another? It's very difficult. It's kind of a metaphor. There are people who have synesthesia, as I'm sure you know. Actually, one of my PhD students is an expert in synesthesia, which is the study of how more than one sense gets connected. And I thought that there were 4 or 5 kinds of synesthesia. Like there are a lot of stories, especially for musicians, who hear a sound and see a color. Like Scriabin was famous for that, Messiaen, French composer in the 20th century. But it turns out there are several hundred forms of synesthesia, of things that, like muscle memory and a sound, or but to translate this, I think what's interesting about kimchi is how, of all the foods, it has, a very strong kind of, it's kind of a bitter and sweet smell at the same time. And it's also, it's a smell that, it doesn't linger. I mean, if I hold it there, it'll linger, but it socks you in the nose, but like the second I pull it away, it's kind of gone. So maybe it's kind of something short. And what does it mean to do something that's sweet and sour? Maybe it's something that's major and minor at the same time. Or I often in my music like to write a chord that is very familiar. So when you first hear it, you go like that. But maybe there's something really strange in there. There's a note that doesn't belong, and maybe it's something that only after a minute you realize, or maybe it's something that when you hear it, it's like, there's something not quite right. So, yeah, so maybe it's something like that. And it's interesting that kimchi it's so varied. You can make it with so many materials, and as I understand it, it's quite individual. So people develop their own kind of kimchi styles. So it's quite diverse, and it's very simple. It's kind of a, I don't want to say, but I don't think it's an aristocratic food. I think it's kind of an ordinary, it's something that anybody can make with something you grow in your garden. So it's one of the world's great things, and we'll have a kimchi movement in our symphony. I promise you.
Okay.
And then we can pass kimchi out to the audience, and
we can do that now.
Yeah.
Can anyone smell this?
Not yet.
We were talking backstage. And you had mentioned you know of the traditional Korean instrument, the gayagum, but you've never seen it played.
I've actually never. I think I've never physically seen one. I've listened to it. I actually have right on my iPhone an incredible compendium of Gangnam music and virtuosi. But
so we have a treat tonight. We have a student who is a gayagum virtuoso. And she's going to come out and play a little bit, and maybe you can go over and try your hand at the gayagum if you want to.
Well, it's definitely, I'd love to hear it
Cindy
played.
O is going to a short performance. Any interest?
Any interest? Well, I can. This is
Mr.
so
Wan,
mean.
Mr. Wan
Why,
put you up for
what? First of all, you're fantastic. Congratulations. So how long have you been playing this? Only 4 years? Wow. Did you play some other instrument before this? Wow. You're very talented. Let's see. So I guess it's just like a harp. How's it tuned? And so do you just show me, it seems like sometimes you play like it's very resonant and sometimes, are there a few different sounds you make depending on how you use your finger? Mm-hmm. And there seems like there's one that's like, no, not that. I think that's all the playing I'm going to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you talked a little bit about the Symphony for the Koreas. I'm just curious how you see music playing a part in healing and bringing the people together. If you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so one thing I'll say first for all of these projects, really any project I do, but especially these symphonies, is that the most exciting thing is we start with a vision and we start with a process, and it always ends up somewhere somewhat different than we expected. So I think exactly what this piece will sound like and exactly who will meet along the way and what kind of relationships will be made and what it ends up saying about peace, I can't predict. But I do think it's interesting. The same time that we gave a demonstration in Dan Elsey's hospital, it was the first time I'd done work with music and health. It was a little over 10 years ago. And some people who took our workshops, we actually divided the workshops into two. One were for people who had physical disabilities, and the other were for people who had all kinds of psychological problems, serious ones. These were people who really were lifetime residents at this hospital. And I hadn't really thought about this, but what I realized really quickly is that, we had a room full of 20 people who had schizophrenia and serious depression and really serious problems. And first of all, working on a music project was a fantastic way for them to concentrate and to focus. So many of these people, while they were working on their music, didn't show any of their symptoms. And this often, if they worked on kind of every day for a week or two, it didn't cure schizophrenia, but it reduced the symptoms enormously. But what was more powerful than that, which goes to your question, is that we could say to somebody, okay, here's HyperScore, now you know basically how to use it. Make a piece that you care about, anything. And one by one, we found that people were making, if you make music, especially if it doesn't have words, you can tap into the thing you care about most, and maybe even, these are people, maybe they'd had something really awful happen in their lives. They could make a piece about that without having to tell me literally what the story was. So music's a fantastic way of sharing things that are very deep and still keeping a little bit of distance. So it could be that for people who hate each other, don't understand each other, instead of discussing politics or discussing form of government or anything very specific, it's quite possible people can share something they really care about, to have somebody else listen to it and to understand each other better. I really believe that. So that's my hope. I think it might be better to do, maybe we'll use text in this piece, but it might be fantastic to have a piece which is just about trading sounds.
And would you consider bringing that to the U.S., the upcoming U.S. election?
Yeah, so I've actually been asked to do one of these projects by the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. And I told them that if I do it, the condition would be that we invite everybody on Capitol Hill, that we invite politicians. We require politicians to be a part of the, we can't require you can't get those guys to do anything, but we can invite them to be part of it because, honestly, I think the divisions in the U.S. now are of a different kind, but they're very serious. And it's incredibly. In some ways, when I think about the situation in Korea, I was thinking about this on the plane. There's the 38th parallel. There's physical, and there's an incredible lack of communication. But it's at least as scary in the U.S. where there's no physical boundary, but huge parts of the population cannot listen to somebody else. You can't have a conversation. You can't admit that somebody else might have something to say. So I think around the world, we have a very, very serious, you could say a serious problem. We also have an incredible opportunity to find better ways for people to listen to people who you don't like and don't agree with. Because if we don't, we're really in trouble.
Yeah. So I'll ask one more question, and then we'll turn it over. We're going to have students have written some fantastic questions for you. And any audience member, if you have a question you'd like to ask Professor Machover, we're going to have a microphone, dead center. There's a spotlight on it right now.
Yeah.
And we'll have someone there that'll just help you organize into a line. But just the last thing I wanted to touch on is Yo-Yo Ma. If you had anything you'd like to share with us about the process of working with him and developing the hypercello with him and for him, and any interesting stories there?
Yeah, many stories, but I'll tell you two right away. One is that when we started the project, I knew the goal was similar to what we ended up with. I wanted Yo-Yo to play the cello as naturally as possible, so he didn't have to learn a new instrument. I wanted it to transform into other, into many different forms. And I realized pretty quickly that we would have to do, besides just measuring the sound with a microphone, we'd have to do physical measurements of the instrument because you'd have to measure the vibration, you'd have to put something on the instrument. And so Yo-Yo truly is one of the nicest people you'd ever meet. He's a really incredibly good guy. But when I told him that we had to put some tape and maybe some glue on his Stradivarius, he really didn't like that idea. So that's why the cello is shaped funny. We built a cello from scratch that had some. And the other thing, I can tell you many things about him, but the other second thing that comes to mind is that, they're all different kinds of musicians. They're, even among the world's great musicians, people get to where they are in different ways. Yo-Yo is just one of those really natural musicians. He had a father who was also a musician who was quite a stern, he had kind of a lot of tension with his father, but his father had a lot of expectations for him, so he worked very hard when he was young. But already by the time he was 6, 7, or 8, he was quite fluent on the instrument. So by the time I met him, everything was quite natural. So the good news about that is that here we are in the laboratory at MIT, and we're making this crazy new instrument and trying things nobody's ever tried. And Yo-Yo lives in Boston, so I could call him up and say, hey, Yo-Yo, we've got kind of a new technique we'd like you to try, and come, when are you free? Can you come in and get? So he'd come into the media lab, and it took a while to develop the hypercello. At the beginning, most of these techniques didn't work very well. So nice guy. He didn't, he never yelled at us or anything. But the good thing is that whatever we gave him, he made it sound pretty good. The bad thing is that he made everything sound good. So you'd give him something where it was really primitive and it wasn't working very well, and he'd still make it sound good. So it was hard to find, all the problems in our technology, because he just made it all look easy. So yeah, I could say, but he's actually also really interested in music and world peace now. MIT has a lecture series. A lecture series called the Compton Lectures, which are given once a year, and they're always given by a prominent public figure who's not somebody who would necessarily normally come to MIT, often a politician or last year it was given by Yo-Yo, and the whole lecture was about how music can lead to understanding between people. And actually, just last week, the lecture was given by Renee Fleming, the soprano from the Metropolitan Opera, one of the world's great singers. And what she's really interested in now is music and the mind and health, which I had no idea until she came. That was her whole talk, which is that's the next big field. And
Do you think Yo-Yo will participate in the Symphony for the Koreas?
Symphony for the Koreas.
Any chance?
I didn't ask him. I don't know. Maybe Symphony for Cambridge. I don't know.
All right.
But we can have it.
So let's see. The microphone looks totally empty right now, but I believe we have a few students that were going to ask questions. So please feel free to take the microphone. Oh, we do have one.
Hi.
Hi.
So my question is, to what extent
Do you want to maybe just say your name and what grade you're in or something?
My name's Taryn. I'm in grade 11. So to what extent does music convey knowledge and insight?
Oh, that's a great question. And that's one that's, as you may know, it's been debated ever since the beginning of time. And Stravinsky was kind of one extreme where he said music conveys nothing. Music is just sound. It's about itself. It doesn't say anything after itself. There's a whole tradition of music writers, especially in Germany, a little bit in England in the 19th century, who, especially people who wrote about Beethoven. There's a guy named Donald Tovey, who's worth reading, who was very specific about what Beethoven was trying to convey in his music, especially psychologically and humanly. One of my heroes is somebody named Marvin Minsky, who made his whole career at MIT, died a couple of years ago. He's one of the 2 or 3 fathers of artificial intelligence, so he spent a lot of his life trying to figure out how to make machines think like people. But he also grew up as a piano prodigy, so he spent a lot of his life thinking about music and why it works the way it does, and how we can understand a lot about humans by studying music. And he wrote an incredible paper that you can find online called Music, Mind, and Meaning by Marvin Minsky. And he actually takes the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and the article talks about, he goes through the entire first movement and tells you how Beethoven wrote that movement to make you think about certain things and to make your mind work in certain ways by listening to that symphony. So he looked at music as a way of leading the mind through certain processes and training the mind. He didn't say that music was about a book or it's very hard to prove, I think, that music is, a representation of a real event in the world, so it's hard to say that it's a substitute for some other kind of knowledge, but that may be one of its powers. Another thing Marvin always used to say to me is that one of the great things about music is that we know that it tells stories. We know that when you listen to a piece and follow the melodies and follow the changes and the different instruments, that there's some kind of human drama going on. There's some kind of play of emotions. That's why we react to it. But the amazing thing is we don't know who the characters are, and we don't know exactly what they're saying, so we have to make that up. And part of the incredible thing about music is that it draws us in creatively, even when we're just listening, to fill in a lot of the details that are not given to us explicitly. So I think the powerful thing about music is that it calls on most of our human abilities, but it asks us to add something of ourselves to make it a full experience. So it's a collaboration, even if we're not composing or performing. But it's hard to say that a piece of music is going to teach you how to speak French or something like that.
Hello.
You're Alex.
Yes. So my question is, to what extent has the opera Death and the Powers influenced our society and the future of musical operas? What is your opinion?
So, yeah, I think it's always hard to say about one's own work, how it's influenced really anything. It's easier to ask other people. I do think that I think it got a lot of attention, actually. That opera was, these big projects start in all different kinds of ways. That one actually, a group came to me from Monaco, a woman who had just become head of the Monaco Opera, and she said, you know, I'm now head of the Monaco Opera. Monaco used to be an adventurous place in the 1920s when Stravinsky and Diaghilev and Nijinsky, a lot of very creative people were there. Now in the 20th century, it's kind of conservative. I want to support a project that's going to really change the way people think about opera. Would you be interested? And I was like, yeah. And so we started the project with very few constraints. And I think one of my ideas in that opera was to make a show where I wanted something that didn't feel like traditional technology. I didn't want to have screens. I didn't want to have you know, something that felt tech. I actually wanted something where the objects would be the actors and tell the story, and I also wanted something that would be about mortality and you know, whether you can pass along everything from one person to another, no matter, you know, across generations in particular. But I think that the way that the technology is blended with the human actors, the way actually that this human being does disappear and the whole stage comes alive, and in the audience you really believe that it's almost a human being. I think this made people think about technology in a very different way and think about what's possible on a stage in a different way. One thing that I really enjoy doing is combining natural sound and artificial sound so that you can't tell where one starts and one stops, and I think that really changed the way people think about things. And so I think the way an opera can look and feel, really people got a very different idea from watching Death and the Powers. It's a very different kind of story than people usually tell in opera, and I think that changed the way a lot of people thought. It was a pretty expensive opera to do, like quite expensive, and a pretty tricky opera to tour with, so I need a special team to bring that around. So I think that wasn't something a lot of people wanted to do. It's hard to do an opera like that, and you need a media lab to do something like that. But I think it definitely made people think differently about what a subject could be, what an opera could feel like, and how the natural world and the scientific and technological world could be blended in a really compelling way.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Daniel, but a lot of friends in Dwight call me DC. And my question for you today is, what are the characteristics of music that allow it to surprisingly bond with other subjects? So like music has also like nowadays been bonded with technology, but also in the 19th century it has also bonded with the civil rights movement, and because of that it affected how people thought about the civil rights movement and segregation. In your personal opinion, like why do you think music is able to bond with so many other subjects and be very successful in itself?
Oh, it's a great question. And I think the two examples and I agree with you that music is a kind of bridge to many other activities. The two cases you made are kind of different in character. I think that the first one about why music is often connected, it's connected with mathematics, often technology for similar. I think, again, something that Marvin Minsky, my hero, said, which now is being proven to be true, is that music seems to not just use more different parts of our brain than most other activities, but it actually seems to connect different parts of our brain in very unusual ways. It may be one reason why it lodges in our memory so profoundly. And one thing that, if you go out and try to look in the library for a book which says, why does music exist? Because every society has music, but it's less connected in an obvious way to our biological survival than most other things. You can imagine why visual art might have been a way to help us navigate around the world, or to recognize things, or to look more carefully. Music, why do we like it so much? Well, one theory is that music might be a way of actually exercising many different parts of our brain. It might be a way to exercise these connections between different parts of our brain. Marvin also used to say that music allows us to follow our emotions, and it brings out our emotions, and it allows us to change our emotions very quickly. So he said maybe it's a way that we do exercises with our emotions. It allows us to practice our emotions without any negative consequences. I can feel moved, but I don't have to feel embarrassed. And he also used to say maybe it's a way of practicing our thinking, because it allows us to do things like look at proportions. Is this the same as that? Is it regular? Is it the same rhythm? Is it different? Has something changed? And so he said we can follow all these mental processes, but there's no wrong answer. So I don't fail the test. So I think there are a lot of reasons why a lot of our mind is being used in unusual ways. The second part of your question is that music clearly brings people together. It clearly, originated as a way for people to bond by making a rhythm together, or to sing together. But that's a complex thing. We usually think of that as a positive thing. So, we're doing Symphony for the Koreas because hopefully we'll come up with a melody or a sound where people from different backgrounds and from North and South will together feel like they want to sing that together. But there's a guy named Alex Ross, who's one of the top music critics in the United States. He writes for The New Yorker. And actually, he wrote a book called, Alex Ross, there's noise in the title. I can't remember if it's All This Is Noise or anything, but it's a great history of 20th century music. But he wrote an article in The New Yorker about a year ago, and he said he noticed, same thing I just said, that there's no really good book about the origin of music, but there are a lot of books that came out recently to try to explain the origin of music. And he said what's really odd about these new books is that they all bring out the point that music is the most powerful way to bring groups of people together and to feel like they're bonded. But he said these new books all show that music was the way to bring people together, to bond as a group so you could kill the other group. Honestly, that it wasn't to bring everyone together to feel like, oh, we love each other. It was like, wow, we're this group, and because this is our rhythm, this gets us excited to go out and bash the heads of that group because they have different music. So it does bring people together, but it doesn't necessarily have a vector as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So you have to be careful about how you use music.
Thank you. And also, personally, I as a hobby, I also
you bash people with music.
No. I like composing music, and I have actually kind of since 5th grade, I've been composing music through just different kind of software programs on my computer that I've known, such as GarageBand, Noteflight, and Google Songmaker. So far, as a recommendation, what kind of other kind of software program could you also recommend? Or or to this audience, and also how would like to be a successful songwriter or like a music composer? What would you need to do for practice?
Yeah, great questions. Not easy ones. The software one, their software questions are always easy. But I'll say two things about software. One is that probably in terms of the software you might want to look at, that maybe the next step from what you've been using is you've probably heard of Ableton Live. Ableton Live is probably the most common software now that can let you experiment with sounds, can let you experiment with how to change things about sounds or composition while it's playing, how to connect instruments to live sound. It's easy to find, it's pretty sophisticated, quite easy to use. The next level after that would be two programs that are written by the same people. It's called Max/MSP, and it has another version which is called DP. And those DP means, it's PD actually, pure data, not DP, PD, and then Max, MAX/MSP. Those are both programs that allow you to get into much more detail about constructing sound and constructing interactions and processes. They're the kind that are used in all the colleges. So if you wanted to learn how to make your own hypercello, to have somebody play something and make a reaction, those are the programs to use. But I would say if you really want to go into music and technology, what I recommend to everybody is learn a programming language. Don't learn one of these commercial languages. Learn probably C++ or Python, because the great thing about software is that it's actually the most malleable and variable tool, the most powerful tool that we have to take an idea in your head and make it real. And any of those software languages are going to make it easier to do one kind of thing and not another. But if you really know how to program, you can do anything. So that's what you should do. And then in terms of becoming a composer, just two things I would say. One is that no matter who you are, it's always great to find somebody who you trust just to get some feedback. And it could be a really good friend, it could be a teacher, it could be a musician you respect. Just another ear, because everybody will tell you something different, but it's kind of nice to find somebody who will tell you the truth and say, did you think of this or whatever. And then the advice I always give to my students is, it's kind of simple, but the real trick, the only thing a composition teacher can ever tell you is to find out what it is about you that you're really passionate about and that's different about you from everybody else. Because the only thing that really matters is to find your voice and what you care about and what's special about you that you can share with everybody else. So what most people do is they find something they like and they try to imitate it. And that's a pretty good way maybe to get successful at a first level. But if you're really going to do something interesting, you have to find out who you are. And so just go and do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have time, I think, for one more question, and then I'm going to invite...
These are great questions, by the way. Wow, what a group of young people.
We have a fight for the microphone.
Hi, my name is Ali, and I'm in grade 10. And my question is, to what extent does music influence human emotion and our general perception of emotions?
I think music influences and shapes our emotions pretty deeply. And there are actually some very good studies and very good books about that. But I think there's no doubt, and you can do research as to what people say is the change in their emotions. We can measure heartbeat and what's called galvanic skin response, which is basically the level of how excited we are about something. So there are a lot of physical things we can measure about people. There are a lot of things that people say about music when they're listening to it. But it's pretty clear that most people have a change of state when they're listening to music. We don't know that much about how to match exactly the right music with a particular person at a particular moment, depending on what you feel you need. You know, we know what people say, that the Spotify and Pandora, you know, make their business by looking at the kind of music you listen to and being able to suggest something at a particular time. But I think the field of what I would call musical medicine, the ability to, like a doctor, to see what somebody needs at a particular moment to feel better, whatever that means, and to find the right music at that moment and maybe change the music in some way to be just perfect for you right now. I think that's a field that's going to grow over the next 15, 20 years, but we don't have the tools to do that yet. There's a great book by David Huron, who's a professor at University of Ohio, which is called Sweet Anticipation. And that's the best book I know looking at everything that's known right now about how music affects our emotion, why it does it, what happens in neuroscience, what happens physiologically, how it works with different kinds of music. So I'd recommend getting David Huron's Sweet Anticipation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you, everybody, and maybe we'll have a chance while we're having Rice Krispie treats outside to ask more questions. But I just want to welcome Mr. Wan back on stage. Yep. Unless you want to say any parting words. Yeah, you can.
There's no mic, but
you can go back.
If you can't find it really quickly, you can borrow mine.
Can I finish?
Yeah.
Okay, can I finish? Well, officially it's over. Thank you so much. Great, it was great. Thank you. And just one last words. I really thank you to everyone who came here for this special event. And it's really great honor that we have young students here. And I think, teachers, especially parents, it's our duties that we can give as many as opportunities to those young students. And that's what I believe that we have to do. We must do it. This is why I'm so honored that students here, they listened to the whole event. So especially, I want to invite the students who will participate Tod Machover Symphony for the Koreas for near future. So can you please come over on the stage so we can see who they are? Come on.
I'll give them a hand. Yay.
Okay, so we have 4. Can you say your name?
Hi, I'm Ryan. I'm a freshman.
Hi, my name is Tyler. I'm a senior.
Hi, my name is Henry.
And you're a senior? No.
Hi, my name is Yeonjae Choi.
Please give them a big applause. And thank you, everything.
Thank you, Mr. Wan, Mr. Micawber. This has been a wonderful evening. I just want to say on behalf of Dwight School Seoul, this came together very quickly, and I was very impressed by the professional sculpturing that took place on our stage. There were a lot of people that were responsible for putting this together. Our tech crew, students who should be in bed now, are here still working on the background. And I would like to thank members of the board, parents, and guests who have shown up, as well as our teachers. This guests here also on stage, this is a big part of our school, is about learning. It's about intercultural awareness and music. I was very impressed by the very fact that music fits very closely into all of the lives of every one of us. Anyways, everyone, there are drinks provided outside, compliments of the Parents Association and the Student Council. And I just want to say one last thing. Thank you very much. The first Dwight Presents Lecture Series, Mr. Tod Machover. Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Farrell. Wonderful job. Good questions and great kimchi.
Yeah.
Thank you, boys and girls. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Please have some drinks.
Yay.